Ancient DNA is any DNA that we can retrieve from the environment or from an organism that's been dead for X amount of time. So any DNA that's not coming from a living organism is generally classified as ancient DNA. I think people often, when they start talking about ancient DNA, think of humans first because we are human. We tend to privilege ourselves over everything else. But of course, we are human living within a much wider context. And we aren't really human unless we consider that context in which we're in. And that is surrounded by a lot of very important and very key plants and animals that are absolutely essential to modern civilization and complex societies. And so without studying those other things, what do we really know about ourselves? So I would argue probably not a whole hell of a lot. Ancient DNA can be used to look at origins of agriculture by investigating the DNA that we can retrieve from ancient remains of both plants and animals. And by doing so, we can compare that to modern populations of plants and animals, and we can see what that evolutionary process has looked like over the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. DNA has been on a remarkable trajectory whereby the phenomenal amount of data that we can retrieve now is just completely outpaces everything that could have been done 20 years ago. And that's largely down to advances in sequencing technology. Whereas even 15 years ago, we'd be very happy with 80 base pairs or 100 base pairs of ancient DNA. Now we're talking about billions of base pairs. It really is that extraordinary advance in the sheer volume of data that we're now able to retrieve. As we've been able to sequence more and more DNA from a much wider range of materials, from much older materials as well, we are just getting a much deeper, much more profound, much more detailed picture of the past. And not just from individuals, but large-scale populations that we can then compare to modern populations. And by having this just volume of data, what that means is that we have a degree of resolution that was just never possible before. And so we're able to combine the time depth of archaeology with a resolution that's afforded by genetic analyses, and between the two of them combined, that makes for a phenomenally powerful tool. Once people had domestic plants and animals, there is very good archaeological evidence that suggests that as people move, they take that environment with them, that sort of built environment where they rely upon these different plants and animals. And a lot of that, of course, is over land, but there's all kinds of really great examples of people moving domestic plants and animals, and even wild animals for that matter, from island to island over waterways and over very long distances even. For me, there is no research that isn't cross-disciplinary. In other words, in order for us to understand everything about whatever it is we're interested, we need the entire context. And so in the case of domestication, it's not just the archaeology of the excavations and the bones and looking at the zoo archaeology. Then we can look at the isotopes and we can look at the DNA and we can try and understand the human context in which those animals came into that human setting. And so all of that requires expertise and a degree of investigation that has so many different lines of evidence to it that you can't really properly interpret one line of evidence without taking into account everything else. And so that means that you have to have large teams of people, you have to have lots of people who know many things about the site that you might not have a single clue about. So really, the only way we can get a complete picture is by getting everything together at once. Whereas if you just study one single thing, you lack the rest of that context, and I would argue that you probably really don't know very much about what you're looking at in the first place.